Picture this. You're cruising down the highway at 70 miles per hour, your family in the truck with you, towing your camper for a weekend getaway. And suddenly, without warning, your rear wheels lock up. Just stop spinning. You lose control. You're swerving across lanes. This isn't a hypothetical nightmare. This is what's been happening to hundreds of thousands of GM truck owners. And the transmission that's failing? It's wearing an Allison badge. Except here's the thing. Allison didn't build it. For the last 5 years, General Motors has been putting Allison badges on transmissions that Allison Transmission never actually made. And now, Allison has had enough. They're walking away. They're demanding GM rip those badges off every unsold truck. And the deadline? June 29th, 2026. This is the story of the biggest lie in the truck industry. A story about 500,000 recalled vehicles, transmission failures that can kill you, and a legendary company that's saying we want nothing to do with this anymore. This is the story of why Allison is done with GM. But here's the thing that most people don't understand about this story. This isn't just about a licensing deal ending. This is about deception, reputation damage, and transmission failures that have left thousands of truck owners stranded. This is about GM slapping an Allison badge on transmissions that Allison never actually built, and now Allison is saying enough is enough. So buckle up, because we're going deep on this one. We're going to talk about the history, the lies, the recalls, and what this means for anyone thinking about buying a GM heavy-duty truck. And stick around to the end, because I'm going to tell you about the one GM truck that's actually keeping real Allison transmissions, and why that matters. Let's start with the facts. On December 31st, 2025, the licensing agreement between GM and Allison Transmission officially expires. That's just days away. But here's where it gets interesting. GM doesn't just lose the right to put Allison badges on new trucks. They have to go back and remove Allison badges from every unsold truck sitting on dealer lots. And they have a hard deadline, June 29th, 2026. After that date, it is illegal for them to sell a truck with an Allison badge on it. Think about that for a second. When was the last time you heard about a company having to physically remove badges from inventory? This isn't just letting a trademark expire. This is Allison saying we want our name completely disassociated from your products, period. Now, if you've been following trucks for the last few years, you might be thinking, wait, I thought GM trucks had Allison transmissions. I've seen the badges, I've seen the marketing. Hell, people have been bragging about their Allison transmissions at truck meets for years. And that's exactly the problem. Because here's the dirty little secret that GM hasn't been advertising. Since 2020, those badges have been a lie. Let me explain. In 2020, GM introduced a brand new 10-speed automatic transmission for their heavy-duty trucks. The Silverado 2500 and 3500, the Sierra 2500 and 3500. These trucks have been the backbone of GM's heavy-duty lineup. And when they launched with that new transmission, it had Allison badges all over it. Allison this, Allison that. The marketing made it seem like you were getting the same legendary Allison transmission that people have trusted for decades. But you weren't. That 10-speed transmission? It was built by GM, in GM's plant in Toledo, Ohio. It was co-developed with Ford. Ford had the engineering lead. And Allison's role in the whole thing? Validation. They basically just checked GM's homework and said, yeah, this design looks okay. That's it. They didn't design it. They didn't build it. They didn't engineer the internal components. They just validated it and let GM license their name. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because we need to understand why GM was so desperate to keep that Allison name on their trucks. We're going to take a little trip back in time. The relationship between GM and Allison goes way back. I'm talking 1928. That's when General Motors acquired Allison Transmission, right after the company's founder, James Allison, passed away. For almost 80 years, Allison was part of the GM family, and during that time, they built some absolutely legendary transmissions. But then came the 2008 financial crisis. GM was in serious trouble. They were hemorrhaging money, and they needed cash fast. So in 2007, they made a tough call. They sold Allison Transmission to the Carlyle Group and Onex Corporation for $5.6 billion. Suddenly, Allison wasn't part of GM anymore. They were an independent supplier. But even after the sale, GM and Allison stayed close. Because in 2001, GM had launched something special: the Duramax diesel engine, paired with an actual Allison-built transmission. And this combination became legendary. If you go back and look at truck forums from the early 2000s, people weren't just buying GM trucks because of the Duramax. They were buying them because of the Allison transmission behind it. See, at the time, Ford and Ram both had solid diesel engines. The Power Stroke, the Cummins. These were respected engines, but neither of them had Allison transmissions. And in the heavy-duty truck world, the transmission is arguably more important than the engine. Because you can have all the horsepower and torque you want, but if your transmission can't handle it, you're going to be stuck on the side of the road. Allison's reputation was built on reliability. These transmissions were used in commercial trucks, buses, military vehicles. The Abrams tank uses an Allison transmission, for crying out loud. So when GM put an actual Allison transmission in their pickups, it was a huge selling point. People trusted that name. For almost 20 years, from 2001 to 2019, if you bought a GM heavy-duty truck with a Duramax, you got a real Allison transmission. The 5-speed Allison 1000, then the 6-speed Allison 1000. These were transmissions designed by Allison, built by Allison, with all the durability and reliability that name represented. But then came 2020, and everything changed. GM decided they didn't want to pay Allison to build transmissions anymore. They wanted to bring production in-house, save some money, control the supply chain. So they developed their own 10-speed automatic transmission. And here's where it gets sketchy. They co-developed this transmission with Ford. Ford actually had the engineering lead on the project. This was the same basic architecture as the 10-speed that Ford was putting in the F-150. Now, to be clear, the heavy-duty 10-speed that GM uses, the 10L1000, is not identical to Ford's 10R80 that goes in the half-tons. They're different transmissions, but they share a development history. They share some design philosophy. And most importantly, neither one was designed or built by Allison Transmission. But GM had a problem. That Allison badge was worth a lot. People bought GM trucks specifically because they came with Allison transmissions. So GM made a deal. They would pay Allison a licensing fee, and Allison would let them put Allison badges on these new transmissions. Allison would validate the design, make sure it met certain standards, and then GM could market it as Allison branded. Notice the language there. Not Allison built, not Allison designed, Allison branded. It's a subtle but crucial distinction, and I don't think most truck buyers understood that distinction. I certainly don't think GM went out of their way to make it clear. So from 2020 onward, if you bought a Chevrolet Silverado HD or GMC Sierra HD, you got a GM-built Ford co-developed 10-speed transmission with an Allison sticker on it. And for a few years, this arrangement worked. GM got to keep using the Allison name. Allison got their licensing fees. Everybody was happy, until the transmission started failing. Now we need to talk about the recalls, because this is where the story really goes off the rails. In November of 2024, GM issued a massive recall. We're talking over 460,000 trucks and SUVs. The problem? The transmission control valve body was failing, causing the rear wheels to lock up at highway speeds while people were driving. Let me repeat that, because it's absolutely terrifying. The transmission would fail in such a way that the rear wheels would suddenly lock up. Imagine you're cruising down the highway at 70 miles an hour, towing your camper or your boat, and suddenly your rear wheels just stop turning. You lose control. You could easily crash. People could die. GM's initial recall covered 2020 through 2022 models: Silverado 115s, Silverado HDs, Tahoes, Suburbans, Yukons, Escalades. If it had GM's 10-speed transmission and a diesel engine, it was affected. We're talking about 66,897 Silverado 1500s, 166,541 Silverado HDs, and thousands more SUVs. But here's the thing. GM's fix for this problem? A software update. That's it. They weren't replacing the transmission. They weren't replacing the valve body. They were just updating the software so that when the transmission starts to fail, it limits the truck to 5th gear and turns on the check engine light. So instead of fixing the actual problem, they're just making it so the truck goes into limp mode before it kills you. Now, some independent transmission shops have been tearing these transmissions apart and figuring out what's actually wrong. And it's a design flaw. There's a valve in the valve body called the feed limit low valve, and it's wearing out prematurely, sometimes in as little as 35,000 miles. When this valve wears out, it causes a loss of hydraulic pressure, which can cause a 4th clutch pack to engage when it shouldn't. When that happens, you get multiple clutch packs engaged at once, the transmission binds up, and boom, your rear wheels lock up. The real fix? Replace the valve body. But there's a problem. There aren't enough valve bodies. GM issued the recall in November 2024, but as of right now, there still aren't enough parts to fix all the affected trucks. People are reporting wait times of weeks, sometimes months. One owner said he was 4,000th in line for a valve body. He waited 63 days to get his truck back. 63 days without your truck. If you're using that truck for work, hauling loads, towing equipment, that's devastating. And all the while, your truck is sitting in a dealership parking lot with an Allison badge on it. Now put yourself in Allison's shoes. You're a transmission company with a reputation built over decades for reliability and durability. Your transmissions are in military vehicles, commercial trucks, buses. Your name means something. And now you're getting calls from angry truck owners saying my Allison transmission failed. What are you going to do about it? Except it's not an Allison transmission. Allison didn't design it. They didn't build it. They just licensed their name to GM. But the truck owner doesn't know that. They see an Allison badge, they assume Allison built it, and now they're mad at Allison for a transmission failure that Allison had nothing to do with. This is reputation damage. Real, tangible reputation damage. And Allison apparently decided they'd had enough. Now, GM's official statement is very carefully worded. They say that after months of back and forth, they couldn't agree on terms to extend the agreement. It's very neutral, very corporate. No blame, no drama. But here's what we're hearing from people close to the situation. Allison walked away. Allison said, "We don't want our name on your transmissions anymore, period." And when you look at the terms of the separation, it's pretty clear who's calling the shots. GM doesn't just lose the right to put Allison badges on new trucks. They have to go back and remove badges from existing inventory. And the timeline is aggressive. 6 months to debadge every unsold truck. That's not a mutual agreement. That's Allison saying, get our name off your products, now. Some people have speculated that this is just about money. That GM didn't want to pay the licensing fees anymore. And sure, that's probably part of it. These licensing deals aren't cheap. But if it was just about money, you'd see a more amicable separation. You wouldn't see these aggressive debadging requirements. You wouldn't see Allison apparently unwilling to negotiate. No, this feels like reputation protection. Allison looked at the recalls, looked at the transmission failures, looked at the damage to their brand, and said we're out. And here's the thing that really drives it home. In March of 2025, GM issued another recall, 90,000 more vehicles. Camaros, Cadillac CT4s, CT5s, CT6s, all with 10-speed transmissions, all with the same valve body issue. At this point, we're talking about over 500,000 vehicles recalled for transmission problems that can cause sudden loss of control. That's not a minor issue. That's not a small problem. That's a fundamental design flaw that's affecting hundreds of thousands of vehicles. And every single one of those vehicles with an Allison badge is making Allison look bad. Now, let's talk about what's happening right now. As we head into 2026, GM is already making changes. They've started putting new badges on 2026 model year trucks. Instead of Allison badges, you're seeing engine badges. 6.6 liter Vate, Duramax 6.6 liter. They're pivoting the branding away from the transmission and toward the engine. And you know what? That's probably smart, because the Duramax is still a solid engine. People like the Duramax. It's the transmission that's the problem. So why highlight the transmission? But here's what's awkward. The transmission itself isn't changing. It's still the same 10L1000. Still the same valve body that's been failing. Still the same design that's led to over 500,000 vehicles being recalled. They're just removing the Allison name from it. So if you're a GM heavy-duty truck buyer in 2026, you need to understand what you're getting. You're getting a GM-built 10-speed automatic transmission that has a documented history of valve body failures that's been recalled in hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and that no longer carries the Allison name because Allison apparently doesn't want to be associated with it anymore. Now, does that mean you shouldn't buy a GM heavy-duty truck? I'm not going to tell you what to buy, but you need to go into it with your eyes open. You need to understand the history. You need to understand the risks. And you absolutely need to stay on top of your transmission maintenance. Here's what the experts are saying. The 10L1000 has a service interval of 45,000 miles. That means you should be changing the transmission fluid every 45,000 miles. Don't skip it. Don't wait. And if you're towing heavy loads regularly, if you're using your truck for serious work, consider changing it even more frequently, every 20 to 30,000 miles. Compare that to Ford's 10R140, their heavy-duty 10-speed. Ford says you can go 150,000 miles between fluid changes. Now, I wouldn't personally recommend going that long, but the fact that Ford is confident enough to recommend that interval tells you something about how they designed that transmission. GM's 45,000-mile interval tells you something too. Also, watch for symptoms. If your transmission starts shifting rough, if you notice hesitation or jerky gear changes, if you see a check engine light, don't ignore it. Get it checked out immediately, because with these transmissions, small problems can become big problems fast. And if you wait too long, you might end up with a completely failed transmission that needs to be replaced. And speaking of replacement, if your transmission does fail, there are aftermarket options. Companies like Suncoast and Next Gen Drivetrain have developed upgraded valve bodies and clutch packs specifically for the 10L1000. These upgrades address the known failure points. They use better materials, better designs, and they come with warranties. If you're going to rebuild or replace one of these transmissions, it's worth looking into the upgraded options. But here's the most important thing you need to know, and this is the part that almost nobody is talking about. There is one GM truck that's still getting real Allison transmissions, the Silverado MD line. The medium-duty trucks, the 4500, 5500, and 6500. These trucks are built on a different platform. They're designed for commercial use, and they use genuine Allison 6-speed automatic transmissions. Not Allison branded, not Allison validated. Actual Allison designed, Allison built transmissions. The real deal. And guess what? The Allison licensing agreement that's expiring? It doesn't apply to these trucks. GM and Allison have a separate agreement for the medium-duty line, and that agreement is continuing. So if you absolutely must have a GM truck with a real Allison transmission, the Silverado MD is your option. Now, these aren't cheap trucks. The Silverado 4500 starts at around $60,000. The 6500 can easily push into the 80s or 90s depending on configuration. These are commercial-grade trucks. They're built for fleet use, for upfitting with work bodies, for serious heavy-duty applications. But if you're someone who needs maximum reliability, who can't afford to have your truck out of service for weeks waiting for transmission parts, who wants a proven transmission with a real track record, the MD line is worth considering. Let's zoom out and talk about what this means for the industry. Because this isn't just a GM and Allison story. This is a story about transparency, about marketing, about the relationship between automakers and their suppliers. For decades, the auto industry has been moving toward vertical integration. Companies want to build as much as possible in-house. They want to control their supply chains. They want to reduce dependence on suppliers. And there are good reasons for this. It can save money. It can speed up development. It can give you more control over quality. But it also means that you lose the expertise of specialists. Allison Transmission has been building transmissions for almost a century. That's all they do. They're experts. When you bring that work in-house, you might save money. But are you getting the same level of expertise? The same level of quality? GM bet that they could build a transmission as good as Allison. And maybe, on paper, the design looked good. Maybe in testing it performed well. But in the real world, with real customers, driving real loads, in real conditions, that transmission has had serious problems. And now Allison is walking away. They're saying we don't want our name on this anymore. That's a pretty damning statement. That's Allison saying we don't believe in this product. We don't want to be associated with it. That should concern anyone thinking about buying a truck with this transmission. Now, I want to be fair to GM here. Transmission development is hard, really hard. Modern automatics are incredibly complex. You've got hydraulic systems, electronic controls, clutch packs, planetary gears, valve bodies. There are thousands of parts working together in precise timing. And when you add in the demands of a heavy-duty diesel truck, the torque loads, the towing capacity, the duty cycles, it gets even harder. Ford has had their share of transmission problems over the years. Ram has had issues with their transmissions. This isn't just a GM thing. But when you slap someone else's name on your transmission, when you borrow their reputation, and then that transmission fails, that's a different level of problem. And here's the thing that really bothers me about this whole situation. The marketing. If GM had been upfront from the beginning and said, hey, we developed this new 10-speed transmission in partnership with Ford, Allison validated the design, we're really proud of it, that would be one thing. But they weren't. They put Allison badges all over these trucks. They used Allison's reputation to sell trucks. And a lot of people bought those trucks thinking they were getting Allison-built transmissions. That's not transparency. That's not honest marketing. That's leveraging someone else's reputation for your benefit. And when those transmissions started failing, Allison paid the price in reputation damage even though they didn't actually build the transmissions. I've been looking at forums, at owner groups, at social media discussions about this issue, and the sentiment is pretty clear. People feel deceived. They feel like they bought a truck with an Allison transmission, and they didn't get what they paid for. Some people are talking about class action lawsuits. Some people are saying they'll never buy another GM truck. The anger is real. And it's not just about the transmission failures. It's about the trust. When you buy a heavy-duty truck, especially if you're using it for work, you need to trust that vehicle. You need to know it's going to show up when you need it. You need to know the company stands behind it. And when you find out that the transmission badge on your truck was basically a marketing gimmick, that trust evaporates. So where do we go from here? Well, for GM, they're moving forward without the Allison branding. They're highlighting their Duramax engine. They're probably hoping people forget about the transmission issues. And honestly, they might get away with it. Truck buyers have short memories sometimes. If GM can get through the next year or two without more major recalls, people might move on. But they need to fix the actual problems. They need to get valve bodies to dealers. They need to make sure these trucks are safe. Because right now, there are hundreds of thousands of vehicles on the road with potentially dangerous transmission issues. And if someone gets hurt, if there's a serious accident because of a transmission failure, that's a whole different level of crisis. For Allison, they're moving on. They're focusing on their commercial business, their military contracts, their real products. They just won a $97 million contract for transmissions for the Abrams tank. They're doing fine. And honestly, distancing themselves from GM's transmission problems is probably the smart move. For truck buyers, the message is clear. Do your research. Understand what you're buying. Don't just trust the badges. Ask questions. Look into the actual components. Check for recalls. Read owner forums. And if you're buying used, be especially careful about those 2020 through 2022 model years with a 10-speed transmission. Before we wrap up, I want to address something I'm sure people are wondering. What about Ford's 10-speed transmissions? Because remember, GM and Ford co-developed these. Are Ford's transmissions having the same problems? It's complicated. Ford's half-ton 10-speed, the 10R80, has had its share of issues. Rough shifts, shuddering, some failures. There have been class action lawsuits. But the specific issue with the valve body causing rear wheel lockup? That seems to be primarily a GM problem. And Ford's heavy-duty 10-speed, the 10R140 that goes in the Super Duty trucks, That's actually a completely different transmission. It wasn't co-developed with GM. It shares no parts with the GM 10L1000. Ford designed it independently, and from what we're seeing, it's been more reliable than GM's version. Does that mean Ford's transmission is perfect? No. No transmission is perfect. But they haven't had the massive recalls that GM has had. They haven't had the rear wheel lockup issues. Their valve body design is different. They don't use the same latch ball system that's causing problems in the GM units. So if you're cross-shopping between GM and Ford heavy-duty trucks, the transmission reliability is definitely something to consider. And if you're looking at ROM, well, they recently switched from the Allison transmission to their own TorqueFlite 8-speed. That's too new to have a real track record, but Ram has generally had better transmission reliability than GM or Ford in recent years. All right, let's bring this home. The story of GM and Allison is a story about reputation, about trust, about the consequences of cutting corners. GM wanted to save money by building transmissions in-house. They wanted to keep the Allison name for marketing purposes. They thought they could have it both ways. But when those transmissions started failing, Allison said no more. They walked away. They demanded their badges be removed. They put their reputation above the licensing fees. And that tells you everything you need to know about who believes in the quality of these transmissions. If you're in the market for a heavy-duty truck, you have options. You can buy a GM truck with a 10-speed, but go in with your eyes open about the risks. You can buy a Ford Super Duty with the 10R140. You can buy a Ram with the new 8-speed. Or if you absolutely must have a GM truck with a real Allison transmission, the Silverado MD line is still there. But whatever you do, don't just trust the marketing. Don't just look at the badges. Do your homework. Understand what you're actually buying. Because in the case of GM's Allison-branded transmissions, what you saw was not what you got. The 10-speed lie is over. The badges are coming off. And in 2026, GM and Allison are officially done. The question now is whether GM can rebuild trust with their heavy-duty truck customers, and whether these transmissions can prove themselves reliable going forward. Only time will tell. But for now, the message is clear. When a company like Allison Transmission doesn't want their name on a product anymore, that's something you should pay attention to. Thanks for watching, everyone. If this video was helpful, hit that like button and subscribe for more truck content. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this whole situation. Do you own a GM truck with a 10-speed? Have you had any problems? I want to hear about it. And if you're thinking about buying a heavy-duty truck, do your research. Check out my other videos on truck comparisons and reliability. Knowledge is power, especially when you're spending $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 on a truck. All right, I'll catch you in the next one. Drive safe out there.